The connection that is happening in the physical space can happen when you are miles and sometimes thousands of miles away from your partner, because these channels and these waves that connect us creatively, they don't know distance. They have no limitation of distance whatsoever.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Unlocking Creativity Conversations in the Demidov School. I am Nolan Hennelly, joined as always by Kimon Fioretos and Andrei Malaev-Babel. And Kimon and I both recently got our certification in the Demidov Association, so now our intro is totally changed. So now we are certified teachers in the Demidov Association, and as always, Andrei is the certifying master teacher of that program, and we are here to pelt him and pester him with questions this week about something we've been dying to talk about, which is teaching online, which is something that Kimon and I have now been doing for a while, and Andrei, you've been doing for even longer. And it's one of the things that the students coming into our programs have a lot of questions about. So we thought it would be worthwhile to talk about. And I thought maybe, Andrei, you could get us started with, how did you come to start teaching the Demidov school online at all?
Yeah, beautiful question. And congratulations, Nolan and Kimon, on completing the 4-year teacher certification. Nothing to sneeze at. It's a very, very intense journey where you start by immersing yourself fully into the acting curriculum and become part of your ensemble of the Demidov Acting Certificate Program ensemble. And that one graduated obviously 2 years ago, but you stayed because from the very beginning, you knew that one of the reasons, not the only one, but one of the reasons you are training to actually be inside this curriculum as an actor is that you want to deliver that curriculum as a teacher moving forward. And that's exactly what you've done for the last 2 years. Congratulations. You are beautiful. You are doing such independent and really original work while still being true to the foundations and the principles of the school. You are able to do it originally. You are able to not lose your own voice, your own creative individuality in it. I keep repeating it because it's actually rare. It so happened that almost everyone who is teaching Demidov today has been taught by me one way or another, right? Not necessarily certified like the two of you, but has been taught. And very often when I see them teach, I see a caricature of myself that helps me tremendously to get rid of my own mistakes, right? But certainly that's not the ideal way of teaching when you are imitating somebody else. So you're not doing it. Thank you for that. And thank you for your commitment to this program and for the many, many gifts that you gave to your students as well as your ensemble members when you were training as actors. Congratulations. Bravo. Well done.
Well, it's been
Thank
our
you, Andrei.
pleasure.
It was our honor, actually.
What is really beautiful is that, as you see, this is not a goodbye. We are continuing to work together. I know we'll continue to work together as you find your way inside the association, which will evolve, but it's already actually very strong and very productive. So thank you for that as well, because I kind of like hanging out with you. And thank you, Nolan, for that question. Well, we have to rewind to March of 2020. Let's be honest. Before March of 2020, I saw some colleagues teach online. For example, I was visited by some very talented teachers and actors from Brazil. And as they were visiting me in Sarasota, Florida, observing my classes and, getting to know the work that I'm doing, they also had to be back in their hotel room by certain time because their students in Brazil were actually waiting to work with them. And I thought, how is it possible? How are they doing it? Well, of course, I get it. They're filmmakers, and so they have equipment. Probably they know how to film the students in that space in Brazil. Probably they know how to film them. So that's all I was thinking. And then, of course, COVID came. And I remember it very vividly. I was in my acting studio that, Nolan, you are intimately familiar with because you graduated from FSU Asolo. I was in my acting studio before the break in the early March of 2020. And during the break, during that spring break, which is about 2 weeks, we received the news that we're not going back to the classroom. that we are now in Zoom, at least until the end. Excuse me, should I re-record it? Is
Yeah.
it possible? Okay. And in mid-March of 2020, while we were on the spring break, we received the message that we are not going back to the physical classroom, that we are in Zoom at least until the end of the semester. And as you realize, this is the end of the first year of graduate training, so that's when the final projects begin to come in. But according to Demidov, you still need to keep the scale work going. You need to keep the Demidov etudes going as well, not just rehearse scenes and then the play. As every acting teacher, probably almost every acting teacher at that time, I thought this was it. I thought we were done for. There's no way you can teach acting in Zoom. The actors are not going to be in the same physical space. They're going to be in their respective living rooms and bedrooms. I am going to be in my own office. How is it going to work? Needless to say, I did not show that. So when I showed up to my first online lesson with my graduate students, for whom, of course, it was devastating as well, because just the conditions of COVID, the uncertainty, right? And then not being able to be with their classmates, not being able to go out, right? It's horrible. Worrying about their loved ones, very emotional. And when I came to that class, of course, I behaved like nothing happened and that I've always been teaching in Zoom. In fact, that's how acting should be taught. While inwardly panicking, right, and inwardly thinking that's it. And then it started working. We figured out, together with my assistant at the time, right, we figured out a couple of things in terms of how to hide self-view so that you're not distracted by your own image, how to make sure that you choose to hide the non-active participants so that when somebody turns off their video, right, they are not still present there, like their photo is not still present, their screen is not still present, right? So because it helps. So we figured out this couple of purely technical details that are pretty self-evident, and it began to work. Yes, I can see my partner as someone who is on the screen, and I don't see myself, right? I don't see other participants, which is a little bit different because when you're in the classroom, you do see the audience, you do see people watching you, right? So that's a little bit different, but you're still aware that they're there because they've just been there. Now they turned off their cameras so that not to interfere with your process, but at the very same time, you are still feeling them, feeling their presence, right? And yes, your partner is a flat image on the screen. But somehow it all began to work. The etudes that they were doing were pretty good. Now, needless to say, I made sure that when I write texts, and those of you who, have not been through the Demidov training yet, need to know that at the foundation of the Demidov etudes are these very simple texts. Well, sometimes they're more complex, but usually for the sake of exercise, it's a very simple text like question and answer. Maybe it's a 2-liner, maybe it's a 4-liner, maybe it's a 6-liner, but ultimately the texts are written by the teacher. They're given to the participant repeats them a few times, but they're fresh, they're very kind of original and new to the actor, which is the name of the game, or one of the names, right? And so when I was writing these texts, gentlemen, I was making sure that they could be interpreted as conversation over Zoom, WhatsApp, right? As a conversation where people are telecommuting, so to speak, right? When they are not in the same physical space. They're speaking, let's say, on Zoom like we are. And day 2, maybe, I started noticing something interesting. Sheepishly, I asked the participants, where were you? And the answer was, I was in his room. Where were you? Oh, we were actually at a cafe. And both participants are agreeing that they were actually at a cafe having a meeting in some kind of a Starbucks-like environment. Where were you? We were actually in a classroom, or we were in a hotel room. And I understood, my God, they actually experience being in the same physical space, B, in a very specific physical space, as it always happens, as you know, in Demidov etudes, right? Actors may not be aware of it in the moment, but looking back at the exercise, they always can say, oh, we were in the park outside, right? Or on a porch of an old kind of house. So they always materialize the space, or the space materializes for them, right? But when it started happening in Zoom, I was really surprised. And then I thought about it and I realized, of course, the imaginary reality of the character's circumstances, of the character's relationships, and of the character and their life is so thick in Demidov, in the Demidov school, that it basically overshadows the convention of me being in front of a computer screen and my partner being a flat image on the screen and the sound of my partner's voice coming from the speakers.
Mhm.
The imaginary reality, in Demidov at least, completely swallows the actual reality, right? We've been posting lately, right, gentlemen, on Instagram and so on, using the Demidovian analogy of the actor's process as compared to that of a circus acrobat, of a tightrope walker. Right? And both of you, Nolan and Kimon, came up together with a beautiful reel, right? With a beautiful video that talks about it. And we are saying, or rather Demidov is saying for us, that the gaping chasm underneath the tightrope walk and the audience watching, right? And the danger of falling down and breaking your neck every second is the brute reality of the acrobat.
Mhm.
And the thin rope, right, and the trained sense of balance that acrobats are developing and have at their possession so finely, so beautifully, right? That is ultimately their faith. And for as long as they have the faith that they will get through, the real gaping brute reality is powerless to actually interfere with their process, right? And so in actors' situation, it's imagination, right? Their faith, their imagination, the imaginary circumstance, the imaginary character and relationship is one thing. And then the reality that they're being watched, right? That they're being judged, evaluated, liked or disliked, right? Is the brute reality, like that for the acrobat, for the tightrope walker. Which one is going to overpower? And in Demidov, every time, of course, the imaginary reality overpowers, because he also has these ingenious ways of merging one and the other. But seemingly, when you are not in the same physical space with your partner, right, it's not as easy to merge the real reality and the imaginary one, and yet it happens. And of course, the scenes that my graduate actors actually done that particular year were some of the most, we were doing the Anton Chekhov scene as the final project, were the most emotional, the most powerful, the most immersive I have ever actually experienced up until now. When they did it on Zoom, it was more powerful than some of the work I have seen in the actual classroom. Yes, of course, you realize when for an artist, that's their only life now, because all other avenues are closed. You cannot really go out, right? You cannot party. You cannot participate in other activities or go to the theater, right? That your training is that breath of fresh air that you're looking for. And of course, you know how misfortune, and of course, it was the time that was very difficult, how misfortune opens up creativity sometimes. Not the way we want it to happen, right? But it does make us more vulnerable, more emotional, more actually powerful as a creative artist very often. There are actors, of course, and artists and writers who create their best works when they're happy on a personal level, and then there are those who create their best works when they're unhappy. It all varies, but ultimately these were wonderful scenes and they were done in Zoom. What followed is interesting because that's March. In May, I was supposed to do one of the keynotes addresses at a conference or symposium in Shanghai, China. There were 3 keynotes scheduled, one by Catherine Fitzmaurice, another one by Kristen Linklater, and the third one by yours truly. And I delivered my keynote address, which was, of course, done not live. You realize nobody traveled to China from the West in May of 2020. It was all moved to the Chinese equivalent of Zoom. Right? And my keynote address was already about teaching acting in Zoom. Because if we think this is something that is interesting for our viewers today, can you imagine how hot that topic was for all of the acting teachers who gathered from China and from all over the world to that symposium, right? Can you imagine how pressing, how hot that topic was? I delivered that keynote address. It was well received. And just on a personal note, not because I'm boasting, right? But the next day I received an email from Kristen Linklater saying, Andrei, can you send me your address? Because I would like to share it with my teachers. You know, she has teachers that she's been training. And of course, I immediately responded. And when next day, I think somebody told me that Kristen Linklater has died, I laughed and said, no, she didn't. She emailed me yesterday. But unfortunately, it was true. So also, a very moving moment. The following summer, I conducted probably 7 or 8 intensives online. Then for the whole of next year, I trained my graduate students in the online, format in Zoom. And on top of it, I also worked with a group of actors from London and New York, training them. And out of that experience, of course, the 2-year acting certificate course was born, right? And the rest is history. So yes, it works. Yes, it absolutely is as powerful as the training that is done in person. Don't get me wrong. I look forward to going to London at the end of this month, right? And working with my London followers in the same physical space. And it's going to be a beautiful physical space because it's going to be the 100-year-old Eurythmy studio at the Rudolf Steiner house. And you know how influential Steiner was, not only when it comes to Michael Chekhov, but when it comes to Demidov school as well. Of course, I look forward to working with my constituency, so to speak, in Atlanta later in July, and also many more master classes that are to come. God knows I look forward to coming to Athens in November to work with our common students and everybody else who will join, and also doing a masterclass at the University of Malta, where I will be delivering another keynote for the Stanislavski Symposium. All of it is wonderful. But the Zoom training, the online training, actually is not inferior. Yes, you can say it has its own limitations, but it also has advantages, because some of these limitations are blessings in disguise. But from that point on, I would like to ask you, Kimon, and you, Nolan, how do you resonate with what we are talking about, with what I just said? Because, of course, you trained for 2 years online, right? And not because of COVID, just because there was no other way to assemble such a rich international group of actors, right, who were wanting to participate in the Demidov training. And it allowed us for amazing diversity and amazing richness of the group, right? And it continues, because now we are actually working with our third 2-year acting certificate course. Right? And God knows they're beautifully international and beautifully diverse and rich. And it allows people to do it when otherwise they wouldn't. But that's not the only thing that actually kind of makes it work, and sometimes work even better than the training that is done in the same physical space, right? Yes, has its own limitations, right? But what is it that you would like to share? I'm really, really interested, because now you have full experience. You've done it for 2 years as actors, and now you've done it for another 2 years as teachers. You received that training and you gave that training in Zoom.
I think one of the blessings in disguise, which at the beginning was a huge question mark for me, what's going to happen with the physical touch? What's going to happen with the physicality that some actors have, or you should have in a scene? And that got answered very, very quickly, because you get this physical sensation sometimes that you want to touch somebody while you're there. And obviously you cannot, because you're just sharing a screen. But what you find out pretty soon is the ability to accumulate that sensation, to accumulate that urge, and to channel it and make it an emotion, make it an expression, instead of just spending it with just a touch, which it would happen in a physical space. You would just touch somebody and then it would evaporate in a sense. That would be the end of it. But in this case, you are trained to let it express in different ways. And then when you go into a physical space, well, we'll see what happens there. But I think that that small physical break that was happening due to the technicalities of it was an immense training that would never happen if we were at the same physical space, because most actors, they're very touchy-feely, so they would go and touch somebody and then you have to kind of break them apart. So I think that resistance of touching, I think it's a good thing. I think it was something very, very transformative in these years of training.
Nolan, what about you?
Yeah, I think what you said about them being not the same, but in many ways being equivalent as far as the quality of what you can achieve in both environments is actually, I think it's correct. And I guess like I'm lucky because I did get to do the in-person training at FSU Oslo Conservatory. So I got to have that year of the Demidov school in person. And at the same time, if it wasn't for the fact that the Demidov Association works online, I might not ever have been able to dip back into it
Yes.
again. So not only is there that advantage, but I certainly wouldn't have been able to dip into it with such a diverse and international group of people. And at the stage of life that I was at, right? Which was postgraduate training, having other things going on in my life, like many of the other actors in the company, many of whom were working, being able to join virtually allowed them to work from film sets, from often hotel rooms or sometimes trailers, right? And at first that might seem like a downside. I'll miss my studio. But something brilliant and beautiful happened, which I never expected. And it even happened when you're working in your own home, like most of the time many of us were, which was that the sort of sacredness of the studio, this is where I go to have large experiences, this is where I go to make art, started to fall away. And all of a sudden, it became that, well, actually, if I am in a creative state, there is no place where I cannot have a large and beautiful experience. There is no place where I can't make my work. And that was one of the most powerful things when it came to actors' least favorite things, which is self-taping. And all of a sudden, the difficulty and the pain of doing a self-tape sort of just washed away, because it was like you were setting yourself up every week, 3 times a week, filming yourself. Well, you're not filming yourself, of course, you're in a live
you
meeting,
are.
but you are. And it can happen anywhere. And so all of a sudden, when the camera would get rolling for a self-tape, I found such a tremendous level of ease because everywhere was a place that I felt creatively comfortable. And it wasn't a thing going in I would have expected. And it wouldn't have been at the top of my list of things to talk about, but it was just its own little miracle. And I've seen it with, the students that Kimon and I have gotten to teach as well. The fluidity with which they have adapted to different environments has been really beautiful. So yeah, I just wanted to make sure I mentioned that because it's an extra sort of benefit that I never really thought about before.
Yes, very important benefit as well, because of course, the way that we teach this course, right, and it's even in the title that is acting also for the screen, on camera work, because let's think about it. Every time you are training in Zoom, you're on camera. Every time you're training in Zoom, one of the very important components is present, and that is the frame. And you might say, well, yes, but nobody is moving the camera, so you're not going from close up to, middle shot to long or deep shot. Yes, you are, because when you move in the space, you are manipulating the framing by doing it. As you get closer to the camera, well, suddenly you're in close up. As you move away from the camera, suddenly it's a deep shot or a long shot. Do you see what I mean? And every time when you are in a different space, you actually are training how to live differently in different shots, in a tight shot, in a wide shot, right? Of course, it changes. We're about to address it during the annual summer course. We will be in August actually offering our 9th annual Demidov summer course. Quite a tradition now. Well, it also traveled from being offered outside of Moscow and then inside the Stanislavski House Museum to now being offered in Zoom. But because of that, we can actually address acting for the camera. And you, Nolan, came up with wonderful title for it, something like From Stage to Screen, right? What is that transition for an actor? Most actors, of course, are trained for the stage, right? But how do I make that transition? And Zoom training allows you to practice all of the aspects of the film work, acting for the camera, without even realizing that you're actually practicing that. Of course, we bring the attention of our actors, our participants to it, right? But at the very same time, it happens naturally. Very good point. Kimon, you wanted to add something.
Yeah, no. In these 4 years, I'm sure Nolan will agree. We have both witnessed wonderful theatricality and wonderful film acting at the same time. It has been a wonderful polarity inside. It's not like you are leaving some part out or you are addressing only one part. There is a wonderful polarity in it as people were working. which is it's a beautiful thing. But I would like to add the fact that actors now in 2025, due to technology, they do get to work with very strange environments like a green screen or a very non-friendly and non-realistic environment sometimes. And even in the theater, if you think about it, it's not realistic at all.
No,
You have to have your creative juices flowing to believe that this is my house, or this is a palace, or
exactly. Where is it that it is more conventional in Zoom than it is on stage? On
Mhm.
stage, it's also all conventional, all completely fake, right? You can see the
Exactly.
audience right in front of you. You can see your peers in the wings. You can see the stage hands in the wings, right? The lights are blinding you and they're not at all what they're supposed to be. And so on. The sets are fake. Of course, the makeup very often is fake. There's a lot of this stuff that your imagination is supposed to be able to overcome. But as Demidov says, maybe not despite, but because of that convention, our faith in the imaginary circumstances grows even greater. Well, yes, if you're trained in Demidov, who incorporates that phenomenon into training from day one, then yes, the faker it is around you, the more solid you are when it comes to your absolute grounding and immersion in the imaginary circumstances in a way. But it comes from the Demidov training. Sorry to interrupt, Kimon.
No, no, no,
Please
no,
keep
no,
going.
no. That's exactly it. That's exactly it. The fact that during to this restriction again, I think suggestibility was trained, imagination was trained in a very wonderful and very powerful way.
And is it a coincidence that, and you will back me up, I am sure, that we are constantly hearing from our participants in the online training, right? I am booking like crazy. Since I enrolled in this course, right, I am booking the way I've never booked before. I get different type of audition calls. When I was called for, background, now I'm called for more principal roles, and I'm actually scoring more. And I'm very sorry, I have to go and film a project. But Nolan is right. With a traditional course, it would have taken that actor out of circulation for a week or two. With a Zoom course, they're still zooming in from their hotel unless their film, unless their shooting is actually completely coinciding with the time of the class, right? Often it doesn't, as you very well know. Yes, sometimes they're trying to zoom in from the set, right? We've seen something like that, but another thing about it, even when they're traveling on a bus, on a tube, right, or in the airport, they're still tuning in at least to listen. They cannot do etudes, of course, right? They cannot train, but they're tuning in to listen. And ultimately, how else could you do it, right, unless you actually trained in Zoom? There is a technical thing that I would like to discuss with you. Demidov, of course, is cultivating freedom, and that's one of the most beautiful things about the school, right? The culture of freedom is one of the major cultures at the heart of it. And in the very beginning, when Demidov is preaching freedom, right, and telling you that you should absolutely free yourself, all of your impulses and so on, he then says, well, with one restriction: you cannot hit each other, you cannot harm each other, you cannot destroy the furniture and each other's clothes. And the funny thing about it is that I used to say it like Demidov did in every workshop, in every opening and introduction to every course, right? I don't have to anymore. Right? It's humorous, but it's not, because I'm leading somewhere. Because, of course, even if you wanted to hit your partner, you couldn't. And if you wanted to destroy furniture, well, it's your furniture. You're paying for it, right? It's not the school's furniture. It's not your partner's furniture. And you wanted to rip your clothes, right? Okay, go ahead. It's your clothes. You'll have to replace them, right? And you cannot harm your partners. So I don't have to give that disclaimer anymore, or that restriction. What does it do? Well, okay, I'll tell you very frankly, especially early in my career, because obviously I've been involved with Demidov the longest, right? I had the privilege of discovering the school, of practically recreating the school after he's been dead for 70 years, not just Demidov, but the school. It's a separate story, which we also should tell at some point, right? Actually, the history of the Demidov school and how it was persecuted in Russia. And why is it that it was hidden from the rest of the world? Because of the revelations and truths that Demidov brought in that contradicted some of the very powerful and ruling, I would say, approaches, such as Stanislavski, for example. And the relationship between Stanislavski and Demidov is something else entirely, right? Let's not oversimplify it. But ultimately, obviously, I have been doing it, right, for quite long time. And sometimes with certain master classes, especially early in my career, I actually missed that moment when I was supposed to come in like a ton of brick and say, take your time. And actors kind of went for each other. It's not happening anymore, right? Because culture has changed. You follow me, right? Culture is changing. Society is changing. I am changing, right? I can predict these moments now and put a stop to them. But it did happen every once in a while when it was nothing ended in any injury or any tragedy, because when you are working with Demidov, another secret, you are completely physically released. And every fight choreographer and coach knows that injuries in that line of work come from physical tension. And that for as long as participants are completely physically released, injuries are actually not going to happen. But what happens is something that casually Kimon already mentioned. People begin to hug. People begin to grasp at each other without necessarily harming each other or anything, right? Or hitting. People begin to embrace. People begin to hide their heads and faces in each other, inside each other, right? What happens? By the way, obviously, because Demidov is now trained all over the world, you are watching, our dear viewers, our dear listeners, you are watching a lot of photographs, looking at a lot of photographs that are being posted of etudes. You will notice if you watch those photographs that we post, the Demidov Association, and compare them with some others, you will notice one big difference. You will notice when watching the Demidov Association photos how released the actors are. That there is no trying, there is no tension. There is absolutely no striving and toiling, and nobody's faces are contorted with effort, right? Nobody's muscles are tense. Everyone is completely released and therefore beautifully radiating their emotions and their inner life, sometimes very subtly. But as Demidov said, the power of weak currents, of subtle, delicate currents, is actually more powerful than that of some stronger, cruder energies, right? But you will also see other photographs where you will notice tension. And most importantly, you will see the pandemic of hugging, the hugging pandemic, where constantly these two actors are joined in a convulsive embrace when they're hidden inside each other. What happens? Breaks. This is how actors who've been obviously preconditioned by certain social instincts and certain preservation mechanisms that are completely non-creative, this is how they turn themselves off. When you feel bad, you hug a pillow, you feel better. You take your teddy bear and you hug your teddy bear, you feel better. That's exactly what they do. At the moments when they should be surrendering to heightened emotions, they cap out, they run towards the partner, although that's not what they really want to do. That's just the preservation mechanism, their body trying to get them off, so to speak, so that they're not as emotionally involved. And they hug the partner, they squeeze the partner, they hide their face in the partner's clothes, and they feel better. Ultimately, the etude, the scene, is over at that point. So when you see this constant hugging in photographs, just know this is not actually Demidov. This is anti-Demidov. This is breaks. These teachers are cultivating breaks because that's the breaking mechanism that is being reenacted when this pandemic of hugs begins to present itself. Every etude, ends with a hug or has like 3 moments when actors are convulsively touching each other, right?
With the
None of
physical
it,
tension
yes,
on your
exactly.
own, yeah.
None of it would ever happen in theater, as you realize, right? Because if that happened in theater, it would be unwatchable because you couldn't see the actors, you couldn't see their faces, right? They would be wallowing in some kind of inner life that would not spill over the limelights, right? The threshold of the stage. it would be completely unwatchable. But it happens in the Demidov classroom. And although I know how to avoid it in the physical space, other teachers, even if they, seen me work or even trained with me, they don't know how to avoid it in the physical space, how to make sure it doesn't happen, that actors do not train in bad habits ultimately, right? So what happens? Zoom, of course, cancels that problem. You don't have to worry about it. So that also helps the actor to facilitate their emotions and to develop that habit of channeling their emotions instead of stifling them in those moments, even when they have that kind of temptation, right? They cannot do it in Zoom. So that's what I meant when I said it has some advantages, because some dangerous things that can happen actually are avoided just by the very condition of training in Zoom, right? It's an example of how it actually works.
Even sometimes, Andre, when our actors have a beautiful etude without this issue, right, because they're on Zoom, and sometimes at the end, one of the actors, when we're speaking with them, will say, "Oh, how badly I wanted to go to touch them." And when I think, well, that's good, because when you really badly want something but can't get it, well, that's all the plays. That's all of them, right? That is that's fundamental to so much of our work, is having a strong and overwhelming desire that is not immediately sated or completed. It's the issue is sustaining that without tension for an entire evening is where actors start to fall down. So I think it's a wonderful place to train that as well.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And certainly what we are also seeing are these moments when an actor begins to reach to touch and then just puts their hand right outside of the frame and probably is touching like the surface of the table or something else. And the other actor is also reaching and puts their hand outside of the frame. And you have total illusion that they're holding hands. And they actually green light more and more as you are seeing impulse to touch. And that's what also matters, because although fundamentally, Kimon, actually Nolan just said it, fundamentally, Nolan, you are absolutely right about that distance and the emotion that lives in the space between the partners being much more powerful than squeezing, right? Tight touch and stuff like that actually extinguishes the emotion because it collapses the space in which the emotion can live. But let's not go into these details. What I'm saying is that because the impulse to touch is green lit and it's there, that means that in those moments that are probably going to be more likely in film, right, where the shots are very often tighter, right? But sometimes in theater, in those moments when touch is needed, is granted, they will follow. You see what I mean? They will not be actually shying away from touch because they've trained in Zoom. If they can greenlight the impulse, that means they can lead that impulse to conclusion, right? When the opportunity presents itself.
I know there's going to be such a huge feeling when they do. Yeah.
There are some exercises that act in Demidov, such as character facilitation, but especially relationship facilitation, which of course is part of character facilitation, where Demidov develops relationship between the two characters and the two partners through touch. So that's another exercise that seemingly there is a problem, right? How are you going to do it in Zoom when one person is in Shanghai and another person is somewhere in Slovakia, let's say, right? So how do you actually do it? Well, we found an equivalent. That exercise where actors are cultivating the relationship by sitting next to each other, touching shoulders, right? I'm not going to go into the details so that not to bore people. We found an equivalent where the two actors are just doing it together without touch, as long as they're doing it at the same time. And maybe even connecting via Zoom or just agreeing that at exactly 3:30 p.m. your time and whatever it is my time, we're going to sit and we are going to simply accumulate the relationship. That too will create these vibes and will create these currents that travel from one actor to another. Because, ladies and gentlemen, how does it happen that two people in two different physical spaces find themselves in the same physical space, in the same circumstances, obviously imaginary circumstances, relationship, and being also the right characters? How is it happening? It means that whatever is conveying from you to your partner and from your partner to you when you're working in Zoom actually is not conveyed via whatever waves. I am not a physicist. Whatever waves are conveying sound and the picture. Do you see what I mean? These emotions, these relationships, these vibes, these currents are traveling upon some other channels completely, not internet channels, right? But some other channels connecting you with the partner on a deep spiritual, psychological level. And that is the thought that probably excited Kristen Linklater, because that's what I shared already in May of 2020 in my address, that the connection that is happening in the physical space can happen when you are miles and sometimes thousands of miles away from your partner, because these channels and these waves that connect us creatively, they don't know distance. They have no limitation of distance whatsoever. Your thoughts, your emotions, they can travel from one creative partner to another on any distance, and not via the internet waves, right? Or internet channels, however it works, but via completely different channels. And that's the reason fundamentally why it's working, which is understandable if you really think of everything that Demidov brings to life in his miraculous school. You will realize that energy has a lot to do with it. And these energies are limitless, and the energy of circumstances becomes tangible and material, which is what transforms you. Because if you find yourself really inside someone else's circumstances, you will become someone else. Circumstance transforms you as a character, as an actor, obviously, into character. So the same thing happens here, because it is so physical, so material, while ultimately being just energies. It is capable of creating this imaginary reality, making it physical, making it tangible, and connecting you with anyone who is at the moment collaborating, co-creating with you at any distance. The emotions travel, the thoughts travel, creative impulses travel, all of it happens. Again, I'm not a scientist, but having been witnessing it for such a long time, and having been seeing how powerful that connection is when people are not in the same physical space, realistically speaking, I cannot help but understand that the power of weak currents and all of these other energies evoked by the Demidov school is so resilient and does not know borders and does not know limits.
Beautiful. Well, what a beautiful place for us to end this discussion today. And I'm sure we'll be picking it up again soon. But for those of you who are listening, thank you for listening. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel for more of this content, and share the video with other people who you think might be interested in it. We would deeply appreciate it. And for those who are interested in joining us in this work, there is an ongoing, no matter when you're listening to this in the future or now, there is an ongoing series of opportunities for you to do so if you check out our website, which is linked below. I'm sure you'll be able to find a class, a workshop, a masterclass, a summer course that will fit into your schedule, and we would love to see you there.
And it could be online, or it could be, but you know, Nolan, one very quick thought at the end. I no longer say, when it's in London or in Atlanta, I no longer say in person or live, because I realized, wait a second, Zoom is in person. You're showing up in person. Wait a second, Zoom is live. It happens in real time right now, right? Which is why I call those other master classes, the ones that are coming up, let's say in London, in Atlanta, in Athens, I call them on site, right? Because that's really it. That's what distinguishes them from those that are happening in Zoom. And while they're also unique in their own way, they're not necessarily superior or inferior. Sorry for that interruption. You were wrapping it up, and I didn't
Of
let
course.
you.
No, I think it's a wonderful distinction. Yeah. And so on site or in person online, which is very much live, we look forward to seeing you soon. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank
Bye.
you.